Greetings, friends. Kambria Evans here to talk today about why EMDR works for grief. And we're not just talking about grief as in the traditional sense of grief, like someone passed away. I want to talk about grief in terms of change, because grief isn't just an emotion that someone experiences when someone passes. It is also an emotion that is part of what happens to us as we process life changes. Life changes where no one may have actually physically left this world, but we have a new world to process because the world we knew before no longer exists. And this is the death of an idea. This is the death of a life we thought we were going to have. This is the death of a way that we understood another person. And ultimately, this is a death of the way we understand ourselves. And we're constantly doing this all the time. And I think that articulating this today and talking about this today will help all of us understand not just death in the traditional sense of someone passing away, but how EMDR works for grief when life changes. And my friends, my God, life changes all the time, so fast. And this has been the case for me in my personal life. This has been the case for a lot of the clients I support with EMDR and brain spotting here in my office in California. This has been the case for the world. I mean, the world, I'm only 43. And never in my life have I experienced such increased, accelerated change. Never in my life have I been through a period of time where things just keep not making sense. And the disorientation that someone feels when that happens, right, is very similar to the disorientation when someone passes away, right? So I want to talk today about not just the grief cycle, okay? But I also want to talk about how we can understand the grief cycle to help us process changes, to process these deaths that happen in all of our lives all the time. We don't really name or acknowledge or articulate those deaths. And so they kind of happen under the radar. They kind of happen in parallel. They kind of happen on the back burner. And they're still happening to us in our life, but they don't get the same attention and care and response from self or response from the world as someone passing away, right? When we have someone pass away, there's some kind of process. We have bereavement time off of work. We have people responding to us. I'm so sorry for your loss. There is a cultural acknowledgement that there has been a change that has significantly impacted us emotionally. And isn't it interesting when we have other types of death in our life, other types of change in our life, that might be a mix of positive and negative? Doesn't always have to be negative. We don't often get the same container with bereavement time off of work. We don't often get the same container in terms of emotional support, responsiveness from others, responsiveness and attention from ourselves to really say, this has hit you. This has hit you hard. This is a change and this is a death. So one of my favorite ways to understand decisions and changes is that every choice has a loss. Every time you choose something, you're not choosing something else. When you say yes to something, you're also saying no to something, okay? Now, what's interesting about grief is that sometimes we grieve when it is a choice, and sometimes we grieve when we had no choice and no control at all. And that's a spectrum, right? This kind of perception of what we can control. It's a spectrum. And so oftentimes when we have these life changes that feel like deaths, it's because they are a death. It's because we have either chosen or maybe we didn't choose something that's changed so significantly and impacted us so much that we are no longer the same. Our life is no longer the same. And how we now conceptualize sense of self and the world has changed. Think about this. This is so fascinating to me as an EMDR consultant, as a brain spotting practitioner, as a trauma therapist. This is so fascinating. Think about the way that we learn about who we are, how we learn about the world, and how we learn about how to get secure attachment with other people, right? How we have a relationship with others. Most of us are born as babies coming out with a fairly blank slate, but we also have these kind of biological drives, right? We can see that we all have these core emotions, right? And they're all the same core emotions. We've studied this in the literature. We all have these biological responses to perceived danger, right? You hear this all the time. All of our bodies, this is amazing, know how to go into flight, fight, freeze, right? Our bodies know how to do this. So we're born with some programming, with some learning coming in. And as we go through our lives, we are constantly deciding beliefs of self, positive or negative, and beliefs of the world, positive or negative. And as a trauma therapist and in the trauma therapy world, right, we have this language around, oh, this person's had trauma. And this person's walking around with trauma. And this person is impacted by their trauma. They have PTSD symptoms, okay? But what are PTSD symptoms? PTSD symptoms are just the body's adaptations for having experienced something so terrifying that the body learned, well, I'm going to present like this, and I'm going to have these linkages available to make sure that this person in this body stays safe enough. Amazing. Amazing that all of us are programmed that way. It's available, okay? I respect that a lot. So we can't talk about EMDR for trauma and the adaptations we learn from having been through trauma without talking about how that connects to EMDR for grief. Because what is grief? Grief is processing a loss, and it can be a physical person, but for most of us, it's processing a loss of what we understood was true. When we have trauma, we grieve a reality that we thought was true, right? I thought it was safe to walk to the car at night, and now I have a lived experience that is not true. I have to grieve the safety of the world I thought I lived in, and now I will try to learn how to be in this world with this new information, right? 50% of marriages end in divorce. 0% of marriages start off with the idea, oh yeah, that's going to happen to us. Let's go ahead and get married, but that's probably going to happen to us. It is traumatic, okay? And there is grief there. There is grief that we thought something was going to be a certain way. We'd hoped there would be a certain relationship dynamic. Everyone would show up as a healthy, safe adult. Everybody would contribute, right? Everybody would be a safe enough parent. Like, we had all these ideas about our life as a married person with a family. And when we have to grieve that reality isn't going to happen and maybe never even existed, maybe there's some betrayal trauma there, right? We can't talk about grief without talking about trauma. Because the shock of trauma, right? Trauma being defined as something that wasn't supposed to happen, but did happen. Or something that should have happened that never happened. These are all about expectations. These are all about what we had hoped would be. And how we decide, right? All of that is based on the past, right? So we see the connection between EMDR for grief and EMDR for trauma, right? And I'm putting all of that under a huge kind of framework of change and learning. This is all about change and learning. And I am fascinated as somebody who has, an education background, teaching at Stanford for 14 years. I'm a mom. I'm a trauma therapist. I am fascinated by how we learn, how we adapt, and how we process change. We can call it trauma. Sure. Doesn't matter to me, but we're processing change. And part of processing change is learning how to be with our grief. Okay. We all have a relationship with grief. And sometimes we can kind of see grief coming in. And then sometimes grief is just like someone shows up on your door with a suitcase and they're like, hey, I'm moving in for a couple months. And you're like, who are you? What are you doing here? I didn't invite you. I didn't see you coming. Right. So it's not a planned visit. Also, when are you leaving? Right? Being sad is a bummer. And what we know about grief is that it's not just about being sad. Similarly, trauma isn't just about being sad. Processing change isn't about just being sad. Okay? And now we've all heard of the grief cycle. And so I want to talk about that for a minute to give us a framework to understand all of these things together. Okay, so y'all have heard of the grief cycle. There was a Swiss American psychiatrist, and she was this pioneer studying about the process of people dying. And Kubler-Ross wrote this amazing book in 1969, so it's an oldie but a goodie. And it's about, it's called On Death and Dying. And she really is the one that introduced us to the idea of patient-focused death adjustment pattern and the 5 stages of grief. Okay, and she identified those stages as being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Okay? And we all know that those things don't happen in a linear way, but those are the stages, and sometimes we bounce around and ping pong through them. But the goal is that eventually, from a place of shock, we will get to a place of acceptance. And what does acceptance mean? Well, whether we're processing a death, whether we're processing a trauma, whether we're processing any new learning or any change, right? Acceptance, the way I think about it really is, has my brain integrated this? Has my brain and my body integrated this as this is the way things are now? And can I find a place of peace in my mind, in my body, that this is your life? This is your life, girl. This is it. Your life was this, and now your life is this. Okay? So we are developing this relationship with change, with trauma, with grief, and we have these feelings we go through while we get to a place of acceptance, or as trauma therapists like to think about this, a place of zero disturbance on the disturbance scale. Okay? So Kubler-Ross talks about denial. And I want to talk about denial because I want you to listen to this grief cycle. And I want you to think about maybe not processing a death where someone passed away physically, but maybe you have had a death in your life of something so big that you feel like you are living an entirely new life. And maybe when that process began, it was slow, right? Or maybe it was like you feel like you got hit by a bus. And the reason why we hang out in denial as the first stage of the grief cycle, or the change cycle, or the death cycle, or the trauma cycle, whatever we want to call it, is because it's normal and makes sense from a nervous system perspective, okay, that you would feel avoidance of what has happened. You would feel confused. You would feel shock and fear. And why is this? It's because all your memory networks, all your neural networks have laid out for you a map of how your life is, of who you are in that life, of how the world is supposed to be and how the world is supposed to respond, okay? And there has been nothing like the last several years that has turned all of that on our heads. Like, what the hell has been happening the last couple of years? I don't know yet. I'm still processing it. I'm sure you are too, right? But as the world has gone through these huge transformations, forcing us to rewrite our narratives of the world, so many of us have simultaneously, in parallel, had our lives completely changed. So it makes sense that the body would be in shock because we don't know where this place is on the map that our neural networks have given us for years and years before this. Our brains and bodies have made sense of ourselves, of the world, of our lives, and now nothing makes sense. And so when you feel disoriented, when you feel out of it, when you feel like this is a denial or a shock or a fear, it makes sense that your body is responding that way because there are no neural networks. There is no map from here. There is no map. Or maybe your brain can find pieces of an old map and kind of pull it together to kind of make a new one. But that feels weird. That feels really weird and unsafe. Okay? So you make sense in this stage. Okay? The next phase of the 5 from Kubler-Ross is anger. Why do we get angry? Well, we know that anger is a protective emotion that has energy inside of it, okay? And energy helps us do something to feel differently, to have a emotional feeling state change. So we get angry, we get frustrated, we get irritated, we get anxious. Why? Because we don't have a map. Our brains don't have a map. Our body doesn't have a map. Nothing makes sense. And when nothing makes sense, we feel scared. We get angry because we can't feel safe. We cannot feel safe. And this is exactly what happens to people when they're going through something traumatic or something traumatic has happened that has changed their whole life because now they don't know how to make sense of the world. Or maybe the way they're making sense of the world is like super hypervigilant, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they just don't care. I don't have any control. I don't care what happens to me, right? All these adaptations show up. All these parts of us show up to try to help us with the disorientation, to help us with the anger because we're so freaked out. We want to feel safe. We want to feel protected, okay? And even if none of this is cognitive, even if we're walking around like, yeah, I'm fine. My kid's life is falling apart, but I'm fine, right? Even if we do that, that's an adaptation as well, okay? Okay, stage number 3 is bargaining. And in the bargaining stage, we're coming from a place of feeling overwhelmed, helpless. We still have some hostility left over from anger because we're still feeling protective and we want to have some action to protect ourselves to feel safe enough. And maybe flight starts to kick in. Can I bargain my way through this? Can I salvage some of the safety of my old life, of my old map? Is that even available anymore? Do I have any power? Right? These are the questions trauma survivors ask themselves in therapy. They've asked me. These are the questions I've asked myself as I've gone through an experience of death. Not just with physical people passing away, but death of ideas, concepts in my own life. It is impossible to be a person in the world without having experienced death, without having experienced the disorientation, the anger, the bargaining, the helplessness, the powerlessness, the anxiety of what we're talking about today. So know that if you've experienced this or you are experiencing this now, you make complete sense. You make complete sense. Stage number 4 is depression. Depression is what? We've talked about this before. Depression is a collapse, right? It is like struggling to find meaning. I don't know how to put this new map together. I have to be sad and angry and helpless and anxious, and I have to build a new map. Right? They say grief takes time. And I think that's because we have to have some patience with our neural networks because they're like, whoa, where are we? What are we doing? Right? That it takes time for them to put things together. Just like when I am with somebody in my office processing trauma and we're doing EMDR, we're doing bilateral stimulation, or if we're doing brain spotting, we're doing, eye gazes in certain spots and they're processing. It's a very real thing physically. For them to be exhausted after we do this work together, especially if they come in for intensive work, for longer sessions or a couple days back to back. Like there is a physical exhaustion that is real because your brain is like, what is happening? People sometimes refer to this as an EMDR hangover. And if you've ever done brain spotting, I'll never forget, I have done several brain spotting trainings with Lisa Larson. She's amazing in California. And when we went through the practicum portion and I'm the client and I'm processing something and I have a friend practicing on me, another therapist, the next day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, I'm texting my friend, my brain doesn't feel put back together yet. A brain spotting hangover is very real. And it is, I think it's more intense and impactful and significant than an EMDR hangover. So we know that it takes the brain time to put things together. We know it takes the brain time to integrate and get to acceptance, okay? And that's the fifth stage, right? Acceptance is when our brain and our body has explored options, there's a new plan in place, and we're moving on. Moving on because there's a sense of a place to go. And people get stuck in grief because the map isn't formed yet. And why do we put pressure on ourselves to make a new map so fast? Well, we do it because it's so uncomfortable not to have a map when we've always had one about this certain content area, right? I understand my kid. Oh, no, I don't, right? I understand my marriage. Oh, no, I don't, right? I have this great job and I'm going to be in this job until I retire and whoop, that job's gone. Okay? These changes can feel like getting hit by a bus because of the shock, because your neural networks don't know where to link anymore. And when your body feels unsafe because there's no map and there's no container around you, and you're trying to learn something new, it's overwhelming. It's so much. So now this is the grief cycle. And this is also trauma cycle, trauma recovery cycle. And this is also the change cycle. Okay? So I want us to understand how change and trauma and grief all connect to each other. I hope that you listen to this today and you have a sense of, I do make sense. I do make sense that I feel like I'm dying inside, or that my life is falling apart, or I feel depressed because, oh, look at this. These 5 stages give me a place to orient to the process. They help me understand that my feelings make sense, that I don't have a damn map right now, that I shouldn't have a map right now because how could I? And eventually, there will be a place of integration. I don't like the word acceptance. I don't want people who have had really traumatic deaths in their life or trauma in their life to feel like I have to accept what happened. I don't think that's helpful. I do want them to be able to integrate what's happened in a way where they feel like they have some choice. And this is where EMDR works for grief. And I've seen it a million times. It is so amazing. When we're processing something as it's happening, right, in real time, we get to notice with EMDR and brain spotting that we have some elements of choice in how we put things together, right? Because what is EMDR? What is brain spotting? It is a way for us to get subcortical, get out of our neocortex of talk therapy, right? And take the narrative redesign, make that happen faster, but then really make sure the body and the narrative are connected, are congruent. Because here's the problem. When there's a death, when you're going through grief, when you're going through trauma, when you're going through change, and you have all the normal feelings we've talked about today, do you know what's helpful but not helpful? Is when you read the books, read the grief books, read the change books, read the parenting books, read the divorce books, whatever the topic is, read the new job book. All that stuff is cognitive. And yes, it starts to give us pieces of where we are on the map. It starts to give us pieces of what the new map can look like. It is helpful. And it's also not helpful because It has a potential for lighting us up, triggering, getting the feelings activated, feels crappy. And it sometimes can put us back to the first stage of denial and avoidance because, this is like too much. I'm out. I'm not even going to process this. I'm not even going to deal with this, right? But then you have somebody come in for EMDR. You have somebody come in for brain spotting or other brain-based modality therapies. And they're processing with their body as well, right? We're not just activating you, thinking about hard stuff. We're making sure it processes out of your body so that your body feels calm. Your body feels integrated. Your body feels more peaceful because we're desensitizing the shock or the lack of safety or the not enoughness or whatever the belief is. And we're creating neutrality. We're creating pathways towards acceptance. If you hate that word like I do, you can use the word integration. I've integrated this as true. Let me tell you some things I've had to integrate as true the past several years. So in March of 2020, I had a full practice. I had 3-year-old twins, and I was married. And in April of 2020, I had to integrate that the world was in a dangerous situation that nobody understood really, but it was something really scary. We couldn't go anywhere. Every client in my practice, for the most part, canceled their sessions and said, well, I guess I can't come in, so I'll just see you in 6 weeks. So I had to integrate in real time. I have little to no therapy practice right now, and we are stuck in the house, and there is danger out there. Okay, integrating that. Flash forward a month. Everybody wants therapy. I'm learning how to do virtual EMDR, and I have to integrate that now. I do have a business. I do have a livelihood. We're going to be okay with the finances, and now I do virtual EMDR. The invitation to learn quickly, the invitation to change quickly is a lot. It's a lot, right? And when the vaccine came out in 21, people had a different sense of safety, and some people had a different sense of danger about that. And in 2022, when I thought, we're coming out of the pandemic, everything's going to go back to something that feels safe, I had 4 deaths in my life that have changed my life forever. And I'm going to share them with you because I want you to understand that these happen to everyone, including your therapist, including people that talk about therapy on podcasts. The first death was January 22, when someone close to me shared with me that they did not identify with the gender they were given at birth. And I had to grieve a sense of that person as I understood them so that I could get to integration of who this person really was, which was important. And the lack of competence, the not enoughness I felt during that time, that was the scary part. But I figured it out. May of 2022, one of my kids gets a diagnosis that invites me to grieve a life I had imagined for this kiddo, for my family, and also allowed me to get to integration of reality faster so that I could respond differently with this information about what this person actually needed. October 2022, I filed for divorce, and I was forced to integrate reality as it was, not as I wanted it to be or I had hoped it to be. And that was a significant death. And then December 2022, my dad passed away. So out of the 4 deaths, only one was an actual person passing from this physical world. And I will tell you, for those of you who have had just a ton of deaths or changes or traumas in your life quickly, it is okay to feel disoriented. It is okay to feel like your life will never be the same. It is okay to feel like it doesn't make sense yet, because our brains can't process all of these changes happening so quickly. They just aren't meant to. And this is why so many of us feel like time has been weird. Time has been weird for years because we have been in a state of shock. We've been in a state of trauma. We've been in a state of change. And so time doesn't feel the same because our sense of being present with things is different. Sometimes we're super present to it, and sometimes we're not present at all, right? Because going back to the 5 stages of grief, we are avoiding, confused, shock, fear, right? When we're scared, we don't process time normally. Think of how many days and hours and minutes you have been scared through the pandemic. So I want to really illuminate this grief cycle and make it come into your life so that you can actually feel like you're totally normal, because your nervous system, right, is always trying to get to integration. It's always trying to do that for you. And yes, there are a lot of positive things that can come with new learning. We can develop a new sense of self. We can develop new skills, new character traits, new sense of independence or interdependence. We can redefine what safety means for us. And death and changes and trauma are painful. They are both things in parallel, often at the same time, which is also very weird to hold. Okay? So if you are someone who's listening to this and you're just like nodding and this is resonating with you, I would really invite you to consider utilizing EMDR or brain spotting or art, any brain-based modality to help you process grief. And whether that's grief connected to trauma, grief connected to death, or grief connected to change, EMDR works for all of that because it speeds up the process of integration, which is so amazing that we know how to do that. And it creates neutrality, or it creates a desensitized experience in your body where you live, right? It does that. It does that. And maybe you're listening to this and thinking about someone you know who's going through it. Maybe they had 4 deaths in 2023. Send them this episode. Let them understand that they make sense. Let them understand that there is something beyond white knuckling it or reading a book or going to talk therapy that can help them. Because no one should have to linger in that feeling of chaos and feeling of being lost for longer than they have to. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen for people. I want people to have choices about how they can take care of themselves when they're going through it. So as always, y'all, I appreciate a clinical discussion, and I appreciate today that you've allowed me to get personal with you. And the reason I do that is because I want you to understand that there is no hierarchy. There is no group of people in the world who are protected from life. I don't care who you follow on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook or whatever, okay? Every single person from every socioeconomic background is going through something, is going through trauma, is going through death, is going through change. And because we know that's true, there is nothing shameful, and actually it's admirable, right, to seek out support when life invites you to learn quickly. So with all that being said, thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking through this with me as we go through life together. And I look forward to being together again next week on the Zero Disturbance podcast. In the meantime, be well, and we'll talk soon.